The podcast begins by discussing the aftermath of Joe Biden's recent debate performance, which has been widely criticized as disastrous. Ben Shapiro suggests that just a week ago, the idea of Biden being ousted by his own party seemed unlikely, but now momentum is building for his removal. The problem for Democrats is that they've started openly acknowledging Biden's cognitive decline, making it difficult to backtrack if he refuses to step down. Shapiro argues that the entire Democratic Party apparatus is turning on Biden, doing so through leaks and public statements. This is seen as necessary to maintain their credibility, as Biden's debate performance was so poor that it exposed the lies they've been telling about his competence. Shapiro estimates that the chances of Biden dropping out have risen from 1 to 2% to 30 to 40%. The podcast details the growing panic within the Democratic Party. Donors and party officials are reportedly angry about how the Biden administration has handled the situation, shielding the president from impromptu settings and interviews. Shapiro cites internal polling showing Biden losing ground in key states, with some polls indicating he's behind in traditionally Democratic strongholds like New Mexico and Virginia. Shapiro discusses leaks to the New York Times and other publications about Biden's declining mental state. These leaks come from aides who claim they were instructed to lie about Biden's condition. The podcast suggests there's an internal battle between those who want to keep Biden, mainly his family, and everyone else, as well as between Biden's aides trying to defend their record and the Democratic Party, and media trying to claim ignorance of Biden's condition. The podcast criticizes the media's role in covering up Biden's decline. It cites former New York Times executive editor Jill Abramson, who admitted that journalists failed in their duty to hold power accountable and participated in a massive cover-up of Biden's feebleness. Abramson suggested that many journalists didn't pursue the story because they didn't want to be accused of helping elect Donald Trump. Shapiro argues that this admission exposes the media's bias and undermines their credibility. He suggests that if anyone still trusts the legacy media after these revelations, they should pull their head out of their rectum. The podcast discusses the White House's attempts to manage the fallout from Biden's debate performance. It highlights a particularly contentious press conference with Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, where reporters aggressively questioned the administration's handling of Biden's public appearances and health information. Shapiro expresses shock at reports that Hunter Biden, the president's son, has been closely advising his father and participating in meetings with senior advisors. He argues that this is perhaps the craziest part of the story, given Hunter Biden's controversial history and ongoing legal issues. The podcast delves into the role of Biden's family in his decision-making process. It suggests that First Lady Jill Biden is the most influential figure in Biden's orbit and has been his biggest advocate for seeking a second term. Shapiro criticizes the media's attempts to portray the Biden family as wholesome, calling them a corrupt mafioso political family that has been making money off Joe Biden's name for decades. Shapiro argues that the Biden family is the only group left who wants Joe Biden to remain president, as they stand to lose the most if he steps down. He suggests that Hunter Biden, in particular, has a vested interest in his father staying in office, given his ongoing legal troubles and lucrative art sales. The podcast discusses the possibility of Vice President Kamala Harris replacing Biden as the Democratic nominee. Shapiro recounts what he calls the ninth look at Kamala Harris, referring to repeated attempts by the media and Democratic Party to reassess Harris's potential as a candidate despite her past failures and unpopularity. Shapiro argues that Harris is an incompetent campaigner, inauthentic, and deeply unpopular, citing her poor performance as vice president and her historically low approval ratings. He suggests that the only reason Democrats are considering her as a potential replacement for Biden is that they have no other viable options. The podcast mentions internal debates among Democratic consultants about whether Harris would be worse than a comatose or dead Biden. Shapiro argues that this dilemma exposes the flaws in Biden's decision to choose Harris as his running mate based on equity considerations rather than competence. The podcast concludes by discussing the potential strategies for removing Biden from the ticket. Shapiro suggests that Democrats might try to bribe Biden to step down by promising him a lucrative post-presidency, including a well-funded library and foundation. However, he notes that this decision ultimately rests with Biden himself and his family, particularly his wife, Jill. Shapiro speculates on the upcoming interview between Biden and George Stephanopoulos, wondering whether it will be a softball interview to rehabilitate Biden's image or if Stephanopoulos might put the final arrow into Joe Biden by allowing the camera to linger on any moments of cognitive decline. Overall, the podcast paints a picture of a Democratic Party in crisis, grappling with the reality of an aging and potentially incapacitated president, a deeply unpopular vice president, and a media apparatus that has lost credibility due to its role in covering up Biden's decline. Shapiro suggests that this situation presents an existential threat to both the Democratic Party and the legacy media, with no clear path forward that doesn't involve significant political damage.